That history can be inspirational for jewelry designers and makers, it's not surprising. The making of jewelry dates back centuries, and some of the techniques to produce jewelry were so specialist, the know-how did not get passed on throughout time. The importance of preservation was a topic of discussion last month, and today I'll be talking to an artist, craftsman, researcher, and educator who has taken inspiration from and explored the very old technique of granulation both technically and conceptually. To talk about his body of work, inspiration, and working practice, I have invited Dr. David Huycke. Welcome, David.
Oh, thank you, Sophie. I'm looking forward to this, and thank you for the invitation.
So, David, to start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Oh, yeah, I'm David Huycke. I'm an artist silversmith, and I live in Belgium, and I also have my own studio in Belgium. Professionally, yeah, I studied jewelry design in Antwerp in the late 80s, and immediately after that, I started then my own studio. In the meantime, I'm also a professor in Hasselt, which is a university college, where I mainly work with MA students and with PhD students, guiding them in their research. And besides that, I also have some time to do my own research, which is actually most my own work.
And you completed a practice-based PhD prior to starting to help others with their PhDs. And the work you created actually since and at that point revolved around granulation. Could you tell us how you got interested in this technique and why it attracted you at first?
Well, I heard about granulation in my study. It was about in the classes of jewelry history, and I remember I was quite interested in the mystical, or let's say the secret of granulation. But of course I forgot. I also didn't go into jewelry after my study. But then at some point, it was 96, so a very long time ago, that the Association of Goldsmiths Art in Hanau, it's a city in Germany, and they also have a gold and silver museum. They organized a competition, an exhibition about granulation. And they asked jewelry designers, silversmiths, sculptors even to make things and make new interpretations of the ancient technique of granulation. I was struck by that, and I thought, yeah, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take part in this competition. And since I was trained as a jewelry designer, but I never made jewelry afterwards. And so after graduating, I had to start to learn my own techniques. I was self-taught silversmith, so I had to learn to hammer and get to know all these things. I had developed my own methods. So I continued doing that with granulation as well. I did not know much about granulation, but I knew some, and I tried to build a vessel. So the vessels I was doing at that time, and I tried to build a vessel with spheres with little granules. And that was the work I sent in for this competition.
In your PhD, you took the concept of granulation perhaps one step further, right? You looked at granulation and how you could evolve it into a new technique. Could you tell us a little bit more how all of that happened?
So without really knowing what granulation really was, and without knowing the history, I created those two vessels for that competition. And afterwards, I found out that there was hardly any granulation in silver. There were some pieces, of course, but not very much. Next to that, there was hardly any pieces known where jewelry was built up with granulation. It mostly was a decorative technique. So there were a few examples known where granules build up, like small earrings and things like that. But the combination, silver work and building with granulation, was never made before. So that was actually a very special moment to discover that as an artist, when you find out that you are doing something which is new. That was also a perfect start to start this research project, this PhD research project. So the beginning of that project was mostly technical, where I started to explore the technique, getting to know the technique, learning, and trying to go to extremes. How big can I go? How long? How, etc. All finding out these things. At some point, of course, you have to read, you have to look at other work. It's not just focus on that technique. I'm also doing other things. And at some point, when you work with very small elements like these granules, they imagine they are metal balls of 2 millimeter, 1 millimeter, sometimes 3 millimeter. When you throw them in a bowl, for example, they don't lie there chaotically. They order themselves a little bit, which is called self-organization of little elements. So I went into that, I studied that, and at the same time also I was looking at structures of atoms and molecules, how they order themselves. Reading into that, I found out that they have been making like this study examples with spheres. And there was this one principle that struck me, and there was the kissing principle. Or the kissing principle is connected to the idea of the kissing number. And the kissing number is when you have one sphere of a certain, or let's say you have one sphere of a certain size, and then the kissing number is the amount of spheres that can touch that one sphere at the same time. So it's a limited number. And next to that, there was also the idea of just kissing spheres. It's when two spheres touch, they only touch in one point, no matter how big the sphere is. And I thought this is an extremely poetic idea that comes through, geometry and mathematics. And that interested me enormously. And from that point on, I also looked at granulation as something poetic. The two spheres also, this kissing principle that interested me a lot, and also this fusion. When kissing and fusion, there's a relation with the two. And that's when I also made this shift in my methodology. It was not just about granulation, not just about its technique and finding all these possibilities, but also how granulation can be an idea, can be a concept to do other things without using the technique of granulation.
I think you've posed a real beautiful example of how a technique can be a starting point, but that you can look at a technique as a concept and what it means and how it relates to other disciplines like mathematics. And
also, Sophie, when this kissing spheres, when you have two, imagine you have your soldering block and you have two spheres, let's say 3-4 millimeter, that lying on the block and they touch each other. So you have this image of the kissing spheres. And when you heat this very slowly with the flame, at the touching point, it will start to fuse slowly. And then if you go on with the flame, then all of a sudden it becomes one sphere again. And also that idea is extremely poetic, and I think it's very inspirational. And also just by making work, finding these things out, I think that's one of the pleasures of our profession.
so, David, maybe for those who don't know, could you tell us a little bit more about what granulation in fact is?
So what is granulation? It's an ancient technique in goldsmith's art. It's a goldsmithing technique. It's a decorative technique where very small little spheres, metal spheres, decorate a surface. It's mainly used in jewelry. That means that it's small. And the little spheres, when we say a sphere of 1 millimeter, is already very big in jewelry. The technique originated like 4,000 years ago in the Middle East, but was at its peak during the Greek and the Etruscan period. So they made pieces with 100,000 of little spheres. It's almost like dust, where they then decorate surfaces, making patterns or making just a matte surface with very little spheres. But what is actually the principle of granulation is that first you have the sphere. That's one of the main things that needs to be there, little spheres. And when you have a little amount of metal and you heat it, it automatically turns into a sphere. Everybody who has been working with jewelry, who has been soldering, knows that when you heat it too quickly, it turns into a perfect sphere. And that's the principle on how they made all this and how I make all these little spheres, by this power. And the other principle is that the connection between all those little spheres and the base metal, the piece of jewelry, is done without solder. And that makes it possible to create very fine joints between the surface and the little sphere. So, but if we don't use solder, how do we connect then two metal elements together? And it's based on the idea of reaction soldering, and that is where not solder is the connecting agent, but copper is, or copper oxide. And we know that copper, when you have an alloy, when you have fine gold, which has a high melting point, and you add copper also at a high melting point, when you add the two together, the melting point goes down. So that's the principle behind reaction soldering. And to put it more concrete, if you have the surface of that piece of jewelry and you cover that with a fine layer of copper oxide, and you cover the surface of the little spheres with copper, and you heat all of that, that on the surface of the metal, there comes a new alloy with a very high amount of copper, so with a very low melting point. And this way, we can heat up the spheres, we can heat up the piece of jewelry, and only the surface of the metal will melt, so the elements can join without the form of those elements will change. So the core of the little spheres, they stay hard, and it's only on the surface that they melt. And back then in the Middle East, 4,000 years ago, it was in the area of Iraq, and also later, they used malachite powder. They had malachite, which contains a lot of copper. They grind it into dust, mixed it with water and with glue, and then they painted it on the surface and on the little spheres. So they painted actually a fine layer of copper on. I don't do that way, because I think it's too messy. And we also have different methods now. I copper plate my elements, which is, it's cleaner, it's faster, and it also works much better. So that's the idea behind, or let's say the principle, the technical principle behind granulation. And what was mostly done, it was throughout history used as a decorative technique, where you have the piece of jewelry and the decoration, the little spheres were on the piece of jewelry. So, and as I said before, very seldom the little spheres were used to build, to construct something like an earring. A few examples are known in history. And then there's also some granulation on larger silver work, but also only a few examples known. So it's mostly in gold and on jewelry. So, and when I was, we had this competition in '96, and there I was not aware of this history, and I was not aware of this, the whole technical principles behind it. I knew some, and that's what I used to start building my vessels only with these granules. Of course, the granules had to be big enough, so I had to make them bigger. Also, again, using the same principle that a little piece of metal, heat it up, and then it goes into a little sphere. I used that principle, and then I built my first vessels. I built them in a mold. So I had a mold, fire concrete, and I worked on the inside, where I threw some granules in. The granules were copper plated in advance, and then they touch, because a sphere, it rolls away, but it also rolls down to the deepest point of a mold, of something hollow. So there they touch there, And then with a large flame, I heat it until the surface melts, and then they melt together. And then I add another 10 and another 10. And that's how I very slowly build up my work. The advantages of building slowly is that I can interfere when I heat too much or not enough. I can saw things away or heat once more, so I can repair also a little bit and during the process. And then I build up until the piece is finished, and then finished is finished. And then it's sometimes I patinate it, make it a little bit more dark, but no filing, no sanding, no polishing is done.
You make quite a lot of decisions when you produce your mold for your design. What's the process in deciding what the shape of that mold is going to be, and how happy are you with that decision making so in advance of actually producing the piece?
That's how I started. I've been working with molds before in casting, so I knew how to make molds. And the most easy way to make a mold is when you, or let's say, to have a hemispherical mold is to have a plastic football, and you throw on the football, you throw fireproof concrete where you can make a fireplace in, and then the concrete gets hard, you take out the football and you have a perfect mold to work in. So that's how I started with this hemispherical mold. And then you can make a hemisphere in silver. But one of the advantages of something spherical is that it can move. So you can go higher than the mold. You can actually make a complete sphere in it. Yeah, and I've also made some cylindrical pieces in the mold. So the mold is very, then the shape is definitely decided in advance. Huh? But it's a good question, because I also find something for that. So I also started building with the spheres without a mold. And then something completely different happened.
Yeah, do you see the mold as a tool or as a part of the work?
Oh, as a tool. Yeah, I know they are nice if they are in my studio, this collection of molds, but they are not part of my work.
I wanted to ask a question, David, on what you said earlier. You said you studied to be a jeweler, but you ended up going into silversmithing and teaching yourself these skills along the way. What was it in terms of silversmithing that really drew you away from the jewelry side of things?
It was definitely the size of the pieces and the physicality of working with these larger objects and with the sheet and the hammering. It was tougher, but I enjoyed it more than this very precise work on the bench. Right after graduating, I made a few pieces of jewelry, but very quickly I started with the silversmithing. I also got more success with it. So that's also, people were more interested in the larger pieces I made. And of course, that's also a factor that plays a role. If you have something success, then of course it's you tend to work on that more.
Do you think the separation of the objects from the body, so that maybe you're a viewer rather than a wearer, or did that not necessarily play a role?
Yeah, that played a role too. When I was at school, I made jewelry, but they were all completely unwearable. I wasn't so much interested in the wearability of the pieces, so I made kind of small jewelry size objects using the techniques of jewelry. That's definitely something I liked, and I also liked the jewelry that other people made more than my own. I still have the feeling that jewelry should be wearable, but I never got so far to make good jewelry that was wearable. So maybe one day I will start with it again, but right now it's not my main interest.
Since it all started with a competition, I who also wanted to ask, and you've also won quite a few of them, including the Bavarian State Prize for Contemporary Craft both in 2007 and 2019. How important do you think it is for artists to apply to competition? What purpose do you think they serve for those who invest that time?
I think it's very important to take part in competitions, especially for young people, or let's say for young artists. And no matter the age, but especially in the beginning of a career, I think it's very important. It's good to, and a competition is never alone. There's always the exhibition. So it's good that you can make your work visible. The effort to make new work is there. That's very good. And if you're lucky, then you can even get a prize and make some money maybe. And for myself, that's the same thing. I also like my work to be visible, but mostly when I'm not thinking about the network or the money that you can win, is that it gives me deadlines and it forces me to do something new, because I have the tendency to continue doing what I do. So to do every time the same thing again. And competitions, they have certain teams, they have a title, and that gives me inspiration to think out of my box.
Your work has for many years explored this three-dimensional. We've talked about, the silversmithing, but recently you have started exploring the material perhaps through a two-dimensional way, and touched upon abstraction. What has brought this development on in your work?
I've been drawing my whole life. I think that's something I did, but I never showed that. It's just for my own inspiration to hang on my own walls. Why did I start with those metal sheets? It was in a time that I was so fed up with my own work. I was bored with my work because it took so long and it required so much planning. To make a granulated piece, the planning in advance is huge. I have to prepare all the spheres. I have to think about the shape in advance, and then working weeks or months to finish a piece, and then again another one. And also the evolution at some point was very slow. For me, myself, when I'm working on it, is the evolution huge. Let's say going from a sphere of 3 millimeter to a sphere of 2 millimeter. That is a completely different work for me. But when I see those things then in an exhibition, then I take some distance, and I can say, it's hardly any difference in the result. And in that time, I wanted to have something more spontaneous, something more direct. Like with drawing or with painting, that you do something and you have immediate result. And there I started to paint, but at that time, I didn't want to work on paper or let's say, or with paint. I wanted to work with metal. So I started to paint with patina, with patines on the silver. And that was so exciting. It's also very difficult because there's no way back. It's what you do, it's there, and that's it. And which is also a very beautiful idea. That is the presence of the artist. Is the moment of creation is visible and is still there. And that's what I liked very much and still do until now. And that's was one of the shifts I made to start working two-dimensional. And also I've been working with, not only in my granulation work with these small elements, but also with big elements. And got my inspiration from molecules and atoms, but also from the moon and the sun, our biggest elements in the universe, which are also spheres. And I liked to work with them to portray the moon and or make a moon. And in that case, I integrated that idea also in this flat work. And if you look at the moon, you don't see something three-dimensional, you see a flat thing, because it's so far. On one of the sheets, I painted with transparent varnish a circle. So you have a white silver sheet and then a painted varnish painted circle, and then I patinated the rest. So it's kind of the white moon in silver on a black background. So I'm at this point, I'm still very happy with this kind of work, and that's also what I'm working on now. And also, I have to tell you something about the sheet, talking about the directness and the amount of work I used to invest in my previous work, that I want to get rid of it. But then I start with a sheet. It's a sheet of 1 meter, 1 meter, a half a meter wide, and 0.3 millimeter thick. But the sheet, like the new sheet, I mean, it's not nice, so industrial. So I started hammering the sheets. And of course, that goes all the way. It goes up and down. And then my biggest effort was to hammer it flat again, try to have it flat again. So it took me days and days to make a nice sheet where I could then be spontaneous on. Of course, this long work also gave me the nice subtle structure of the sheet, and that's something that's some extra value in comparison to the industrial sheet.
In a way, many of your pieces are extremely well made, and it's fair to say you have an eye for detail, that it has to be just so, or I think you're not ready to release the piece yet. Could you share a little bit more on what happens in your process? When do you decide that it is, particularly with this sheet, when is it good? How can you, where do you stop? And perhaps as well, what made you choose then silver, for example? Because if you've talked about how you draw, but these pieces you don't consider necessarily your work, what's your relationship with the silver that you keep being drawn into this material, which does have its slowness to it in terms of manufacturing it?
Since I'm always starting with something I don't know. It's I'm trying things out, I'm learning, and then there is this huge concentration on the work, and then I'm trying to do as good as I can. But I mean, these things go slow. It can take years. Then at some point, I mastered this technique so good that I can almost finish it like it's made by a machine. And then I also start getting bored with it. That's something I don't want, but that's a little bit in me to go to this perfection and to have complete control over everything. But as an artist, I don't like that idea very much. So what I do to challenge that is that I very often, in my choice of material, I make the sheet too thin, for example, or I make my work too big, making it hardly possible to have it perfectly finished. And that's what I'm very interested in. For the example of the sheet, it's too big to have a flat sheet. I can never get it flat again. So the structure, which is caused by the hammering, but it's a useless hammering, because you had a flat sheet. So why would you hammer it?
In a way, David, would you say that we as viewers can see the debate you have internally between your craftsman and your artist, and that we are sort of witnessing you challenging, you the artist challenging you the craftsman?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's very well formulated, that these things are in a battle. So this perfect idea of craft is interesting, but I think I can do that in my own way, and then at a certain point, I think it's it doesn't always have this poetic idea, and that's something I'm more interested in. Also, this control. All of a sudden I made this book titled "Risky Business," and it refers to the work I'm trying to do now to put more risk in my own work. For example, when I'm also granulating more in a traditional way. I started with that a few years ago. So imagine it's a work. It's like 30 centimeters high. It's a vessel. 0.8 sheet hammered, and on that sheet I granulate very small little spheres. So what is granulation on a sheet? That means that the surface of the sheet needs to be molten, but not the inside of the sheet. I mean, it's a very small difference between outside and inside. So, and it's with a flame which is like 0.5 meter. It's this kind of flame. It's like a huge torch to get this surface molten. I mean, this kind of risk, I think that's yeah, and this can never be done perfectly. Although I try to work perfectly, but through the choice of material and the choice of the difficult process, it can never be perfect. So that's some idea that I quite like.
And the piece you're talking about, David, has quite a lot of space between the granules by positioning them so far away from each other. If there is a mistake, everyone will be able to see because there's not another granule next to it that will cover up the connection between the granule and the. So by positioning it that way, you're also opening up the viewer's opportunity, sort of saying this is a process that is really risky and challenging, which you might otherwise be able to mask. We get a picture of what it is like to make these pieces, even though we're obviously not involved.
Yeah, but still, it's yeah, it's true what you say, but it still is something difficult. I mean, because like my peers understand what I'm working on, and they have the same problems. I mean, every craftsman that works on a serious level has the same problems. You cannot make good work without making lots of mistakes in it, because yeah, other than then you can repeat something that's already existing, and that's not the idea. But yeah, all this effort and yeah, difficulties that go into a work. I mean, I think 80% of the people don't see that, don't feel that. And it's then, yeah, those people who feel it, or let's say, then you can make a connection with those when they understand the work. Yeah.
In terms of communicating to the 80% who don't necessarily speak the language of the craft, have you found any media or communication tools that have bridged that gap successfully, or do you feel that's still something that isn't quite resolved?
No, I don't know. I'm not working on that very intensively on this communication part. I communicate through my website, and to, you know, every 10 years I try to make a book. Those people like those books because it's appealing work, I would say. But still, I mean, all this, lots of things behind the work is not is lost in a kind of book. It's very difficult then to show all this craft, because it's not that I want to share everything to everybody about how I do things, what materials I use, but sharing too much crafty things then takes the focus away from the ideas as well. So it's a difficult balance, I think, in this communication part.
Some listeners may not know, but you were in fact one of my professors when I was completing my MA in Hasselt, and you introduced me to a range of key critical text on craft. So talking about the ideas and how important is it for you to engage with the theory, and throughout the years has this changed?
Reading is good for everybody. And as an artist, I think you should read what inspires you, what gives you inspiration, and what gives you energy to work, for example, or that gives you ideas, or changes your view on things. I think those things one should read as much as possible. But then, and I did that too, I'm quite a reader. But then for a PhD, which is a focused project, one has to read more specifically, because you have to know what's going on in the world, what the theory says about your discipline, what other researchers have done. You have to know that. because you also have to write something about it in the end of the research. So there I dug into everything which was available and what I could find, and I read it all. Where you start somewhere, right? You find one text that you think, yeah, this is really interesting, and then you look at the bibliography, see what kind of text this text is referencing to, and then you slowly build up your own bibliography. Yeah?
The theory that you have been reading has spanned multiple disciplines. So, for example, you started looking at mathematical concepts, and how did you bridge the gap? Because the language of these books or references are perhaps very different than the artistic language that we're perhaps used to. Were you able to make that shift?
The language is not so different than the artistic language, because it's also very visual. Eh? It's a very visual idea, and many principles that we work with happen in nature as well. The growth of a tree or the growth of a flower, I think that there's lots of principles that we use as well. It's gravity, for example, as something that everybody uses, or let's say the fluidity of water, the strongness of metal. So there is a bridge, but that bridge is small. If the interest is there, I think there's no problem in reading it. So what I especially was interested in was in this idea of self-organization, the idea of chaos and order. What I was interested in, geometry, and then this craft theory, which was also interesting. But yeah, you read and then you get different opinions from different authors. And that's it, because I haven't been working on my own idea what craft should be. I don't see that as my job. I'm not in a position to I have my idea, but that's it. I'm not going to write a book about it.
Yeah, so does writing still play a role because you wrote for your PhD? Do you still write about your work and how the ideas relate, or are you now focusing mainly on the objects and allow them to speak for themselves?
Well, I've been writing some things, and what I mostly do is talking about it. I mean, I like to give lectures about my work and to try to explain ideas and my choices, my decisions in how I work. The writing and the tools of writing I'm mostly using when I work with my students, when I supervise my PhD students, when they have to write about their work, which is of course a constant challenge. And yeah, it's a difficult thing to talk about your work and to write about it. So for me, I'm not so much into that anymore unless I have to, but most of the time I'm using this, what I learned, to help other people.
If there's anyone listening who perhaps has not had the opportunity to be introduced to sort of key texts in craft, which books or texts were most influential to you, and or do you think they should really perhaps start with?
When I was discovering all those texts, it was early 2000, so it's 15 to 20 years ago. Huh? But what I was very interested in was what Bruce Metcalf was writing. And Bruce Metcalf, he's a jeweler, but he's also a very good writer. And he published regularly in the Snack magazine, Metalsmith. It's the magazine of the Society of North American Goldsmiths. And from there, from his texts, I then went to other writers. Also, this Bruce Metcalf, it was very accessible. It was not so difficult because, for example, Glenn Adamson, he's a very good writer and he's a very smart person, gives wonderful lectures, but his writings are difficult. And if I give that to my students, it takes them so much time to get to understand it, and then the fun is gone. So I'm also when I try to advise, I try to a little bit more low profile. What I also think is a key work is the Craftsman of Richard Sennett. I had much pleasure in reading that. And then in Scandinavia, there has been lots of things written about craft. And the good thing there, they are not native speakers, not native English speakers, and then they write more accessible for my students, for example. Jordan Weitenberg is one of those who can write very nice, makes very nice work. And then I also wrote down Marianne Unger for the jewelry people, Lisbeth and Besten. And what is now very popular, I see with our PhD students, is Tim Ingold. He's the man, and they all read his books. So that might also be something. He's not writing about craft, but he's writing about lots of other things, and he touches upon craft, touches upon research, on life, on nature.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. And then my last question is there anything you are currently working on that you're willing to share, and something that we might want to keep an eye out for, a presentation or an exhibition, or are you working on a new book, or what can we expect in the near future from you?
I have to disappoint you a little bit, Sophie. I'm not working on a specific project. But what I see with my own work is that it's changing. I'm going to this two-dimensional, so I'm exploring there new things. I'm making things in my studio, trying things out. Recently, I've been thinking about, maybe I have to put another solo show together, but that will not be for this year. I mean, a solo show we are already end of April, so I presume it will be the end of 22 that one can expect something new. It's a slow profession.
Oh, but that is the beauty, I think, of your work. You can tell that there has been time in the making, and it's to be celebrated, isn't it? Looking at his inspirational work and listening to David speak, it is evident that working in metal and producing crafted pieces is a balancing act between perfecting and risk-taking. For his quest to write the next chapter of an old technique and showing us how to take inspiration from practice in doing and reflecting, I would like to thank you very much, David. Your work and words illustrate that committing to a life of artistic making is one of continuous questioning and evolving, and that our medium holds plenty more to be discovered. Thanks so much for joining me for this inspiring conversation.
Thank you for the invitation.
Next month, I'll be joined by another guest, so watch this space to find out who it is. But for now, this was Sophie Boons for the BAJ podcast episode titled Mastery and Risk Taking with Granulation and Metal with Dr. David Huycke. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.